One of the most forgotten and underestimated players on this Kings team coming into the next season is Kevin Huerter because he obviously missed the end of last season with that injury. He started to work out again and he will get another update on that in mid-October. So he may not be fully back by the time the season comes around, but it seems like he'll be healthy pretty soon here and he'll be able to contribute to the Kings very early on in this coming season. And he's a player that many, including myself, thought would be traded multiple times within the last year. But yet here he is. He's still here, and that makes him still a very important player. By all accounts, the Kings are going to go into this next season with him as an important player. Now, maybe not a starting player anymore, but still a pretty important player because Monte McNair, when he was talking to the media, Kevin Huerter was one of the players he mentioned when he was, listing off important players for the Kings: Fox, DeRozan, Sabonis, Monk. Like, he listed Huerter with those guys. And so I think Kevin Huerter has kind of become one of the more underrated players on this Kings team just because he had a bad season last year. And because I think it's obvious that the Kings need help at the wing position defensively, and Kevin Huerter doesn't really bring that. So that makes Huerter one of the trade chips to go out and get a player like that. But if we're not going to make a trade, or if the trade isn't there to be made, then he's going to stick around and he can still be very important for this team. And so that's why I think this player preview for Kevin Huerter is actually the one that I've been most excited to make, because I think he's in the most interesting spot of any player on this Kings roster. And his season could go very different ways. He could get completely benched and not even get minutes if he continues to play like he did at times last season, or he could win himself that starting spot again if he plays like he did 2 seasons ago. And so it's really all up to him and how he plays and how he embraces whatever role is given to him. Before we get into the rest of this player preview, if you do enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe, leave a like. As always, shout out to Cody Willis for supporting the channel and being a member. If you really enjoy the content, you too can become a member, and we just got very cool new badges for members. So if you want that very cool new badge, you can become a member and support the channel. So let's get into the rest of this player preview. For the last 2 seasons, ever since Kevin Huerter got to the Kings, he has been, when healthy, the starter on this team. Now, there were a few times last season where Chris Duarte got in there to start a few games, and maybe Keon Ellis for a few when Huerter was healthy. I can't exactly remember, but for the most part, he was starting every single game. That was his role. I think he came off the bench 5 times last season. That's just not what he's been doing with this team. So it really does seem at this point that his role going into next season will be off the bench, especially since he's coming back from his injury. And so that's going to hamper his training camp. And so he's probably not going to be able to win that starting spot in training camp. But that being said, I think he can pretty easily win that starting spot back, because when Kevin Huerter is on the floor for the Kings, whether he is last season's Kevin Huerter, averaging 10 points per game on a bad 3-point percentage and just not playing well, being a liability defensively, not being able to hit shots from the mid-range, even if he is that Kevin Huerter, he still adds something to this Kings offense, because teams are still having to chase him around the perimeter. They're still going to respect his 3-point shot. One bad season doesn't really change that. And also, if teams just keep giving him open looks, he's a good enough shooter, he's going to knock them down. And he's a streaky shooter, so I think he could very easily bounce back next season and be much better from the 3-point line. I don't expect him to be as bad as he was last season. Last season, Kevin Huerter shot about 36% from 3 on 5 attempts per game. The season before that, he was at 40% on 6.8 attempts per game. 36% really isn't the worst number. It's still solid, but just for him, coming off a 40% season and also just his wide open 3-point percentage was not where you want it to be. So it felt worse than it was. But he still creates so much space out there because he is a great shooter. And so hopefully he can get back up to, the 38% mark. But I mean, even if he doesn't, he still is a massive asset to the Kings offense. And he makes the Kings a better team when he's on the floor. Now, it may not be what the Kings need in that starting lineup. If Keon Ellis is able to knock down threes at even close to the clip that he did last season, then I think he should be the starter because Keon is such a great defender and disruptor at the point of attack. He's also good off ball, baiting passes to get those steals. And so I think that's more what the Kings need. And so if Keon can be that 3-point shooter that can also do a little bit off the bounce, to keep defenses honest and, be enough of a passer, again, to keep defenses honest, then I think that's the route the Kings should go. But I think there is a real possibility that we go into next season and Keon Ellis struggles a bit from three. He's not playing as well offensively. Maybe he's getting exploited on the defensive end by size because we have to remember it is a small sample size that we have seen of Keon Ellis. The Kings have shown that they can be a very good team with Kevin Huerter starting. And I think when Kevin Huerter was injured at the end of last season, I do think the focus was mainly on Monk being injured. But if Monk had been out and we still had Kevin Huerter, I think we have a much better shot at making the playoffs because the offense is just so much better with Kevin Huerter on the floor. Again, even if he's not shooting the ball well, because of the gravity that he has off the ball and the space that he creates. And he's not some super small guard that just gets exploited defensively every time down. Yes, he's not the best on-ball defender, but we have to remember he is 6'7". He's a long defender, and effort is definitely never the problem for him on that end. The Kings really didn't do much to get better defensively, but they're just trying to get back to where they were 2 seasons ago offensively while maintaining the internal improvement that they made last season defensively. And so I think especially as a regular season team, I think the Kings could be around an average defense, even if you're starting Kevin Huerter. Now maybe, when you get to the playoffs, things would get a little tricky and you could see the Kings get exploited a lot more there. But I do think as a regular season defense, we've seen worse on paper defensive teams be good defensively. I think Huerter will have a bounce back season when it comes to shooting threes. I mean, his numbers were just too bad last year for him to not have a bounce back season based on what he has done the rest of his career. I mean, when you just look at his wide open 3-point percentage, 2 seasons ago, 42.4% on wide open threes, a great number. And then last season dropped to 34.2%. And when you look at the tracking numbers, the more open Huerter was last season, the worse his percentages got. And so to me, that's like a mental thing for him. And I think that's what we've seen. He gets in his own head, and that's why he's a streaky player. And that tracking data isn't always the best, but I think it matches the eye test when you watch him. He's just not a very good shooter, or he wasn't last season, when he's really open because, again, he gets in his head. He has too much time. The real problem last season was his percentages in the mid-range and in the paint went down as well. And so you just need him to bounce back a little bit to be able to knock down a better percentage of those open threes and to be able to counter hard closeouts a little better by being able to shoot a little better from the mid-range, be better when it comes to finishing in the paint. Because 2 seasons ago, what made the Kings offense so lethal was everyone could make a play to some extent, maybe not handling the ball, but they could attack a closeout and make the right pass or make the shot, make the finish. And Kevin Huerter was a big part of that, and he just didn't do that last season. So he could win that starting spot back, and the reason I think that is because we've just seen the Kings not want to put Malik Monk into the starting lineup, just because he's better running that second unit. So I do think it is between Keon Ellis and Kevin Huerter for that starting 2-guard spot. But if Kevin Huerter does end up being off the bench, he is probably going to be playing the 3 off the bench instead of the 2. And that's a very interesting prospect to me. Because, first of all, the Kings haven't had a backup defensive wing that they've played consistently for the last 2 seasons. Like you have Kessler Edwards. He didn't play consistently, but he was, one of those guys. And you had, I mean, you could list a bunch of players that haven't played consistently, guys that we've brought in like Chima Moneki and Juan Toscano Anderson, guys that aren't on the team anymore, that we've tried to bring in to fill that role. But really, off the bench, it's not as essential to just have like a 1 through 5 that meshes together, because you can obviously mix lineups, especially now with DeRozan in there. And I think Kevin Huerter can be better defensively if he's guarding slower guys and if he's guarding guys that aren't going to just take him off the bounce. Of course, I don't expect him to just, be way better defensively. And his minutes might not be consistent. And I think that's the one worry, because when he's out there alongside Malik Monk, like I don't know how much the Kings want to play Malik Monk and Kevin Huerter together, because in the past I feel like we haven't really seen them want to play those two together that much. And then you also have a guy like Jordan McLaughlin off the bench. Like if he's getting minutes, then it's McLaughlin, Monk, and Huerter. Like it's not the ideal situation. And so I think the biggest concern with Kevin Huerter is, what if, he starts to see his minutes get pulled back at times. Some games he's just not really playing because of the matchup. Some games he is playing a lot. But then in those games where he does get the opportunity, like now his confidence is gone, because he is that confidence player. He's a streaky player. And so this next season for him, it's all about, can he embrace whatever role he is given, especially if it is that role off the bench? Because I think we know he can be good in a role as a starter, but can he be better in a role off of the bench? If he comes into this next season and he is, I think he's going to be, prepared for it. He's already mentally prepared for it. So that's better than last season where he is the starter. And then all of a sudden it's like, why is Chris Duarte starting a couple games here? Like, that's not a good feeling for him. And so the hope is like this season, he's already kind of preparing himself to go into this season and possibly play that backup role, because he has the ability to absolutely thrive in a backup role where he just comes on against second units where maybe the defensive assignment isn't as tough, and he can just come in, run around, and shoot threes. Like that sounds like a role that he could thrive in, but just the problem is that confidence. If a few games he's not getting the opportunities, he doesn't get those shots up, and if he's just getting less shots per game, because that's the life of a backup player. As a starter, Kevin Huerter would get the first play of the game run for him all the time, because the Kings wanted to get him going. And when you're a backup, you hear guys talk about it all the time. It's like the difference between a good game in that backup role or a bad game is the one shot you get at the 3-point line. It's like you got to make that shot. And if you don't make that shot, then you're not going to get another one. And all of a sudden you're benched and it's a bad game. But if you make that shot, then they leave you out there, you get another one, make that one. It's like, it's the life of the backup role, I think, is just so different to the starting role. And so how Kevin Huerter adapts to the role that's given to him is going to be the thing that decides whether he has a successful season, a bounce back season, or not. When you look at the minutes that he's played throughout his career, last season was the least amount of minutes per game he's gotten at 24.4 minutes per game. Before that, it was his rookie season with 27.3 points per game. He was always around 30 minutes per game in his career. I think another thing that's going to be interesting with Huerter is, with the addition of DeMar DeRozan, like Huerter is still going to get plenty of those dribble handoff looks with Domantas Sabonis. But most of Huerter's shots come from above the break. He doesn't shoot that many in the corner. And when you look at his above the break three-point percentages, like 2 seasons ago, he was at 40% on 423 attempts per game. And then last season, he was at 34.4% on 279 attempts. So he might be asked to sit in the corner a little bit more with a guy like DeRozan, who is such a great isolation scorer. So maybe those corner three looks go up for everyone on the team. And so that could be important for him, or it might not be that important because depending on how the Kings, deploy rotations, it's like Herter might just be out there with Sabonis and then not be out there with DeRozan. We could change things up like that, just especially for defensive purposes. I do think it might make more sense to have Herter out there, less with DeRozan, more with other guys, but I don't know. I haven't put too much thought into that, so we'll have to see. A big part of this season could be dictated by if Kevin Herter bounces back or not. Because if he doesn't, sure, the Kings can still be a very good team. But if he does bounce back and plays well, whether that's in a starting role or off the bench, that just adds just another lethal element to the Kings and an underrated weapon for the Kings to use. And it could propel the Kings back to where they want to be in terms of where they place in the league in offensive rating. And of course, like throughout the whole season, there's going to be trade rumors. I mean, that's another element of, especially with like Kevin Huerter, like I said, a confidence player. It's like if he's hearing trade rumors all the time, how does that affect him? And I doubt those will stop just because of the Kings' lack of wing depth. I don't know what makes it more likely for him to get traded. Is it him playing well and being valuable to another team? Or is it him playing poorly and the Kings just want to try to get off of him? I don't really know. But either way, him playing well is going to make him more valuable both to the Kings and on the trade market. So I'm really hoping for a bounce back season from Red Velvet. Anyways, that is it for this episode of the Roll Report and this player preview. I believe the next player I have lined up is Keon Ellis. And then after that, it gets interesting because, we got like Trey Lyles, Alex Len, Jordan McLaughlin, Devin Carter, although he's, not going to play for a lot of this season. But I might group some of those players together, especially towards the end, the ones that might not play as much, but we'll see. So let me know which player you are excited about that is left to do. And I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.